In the Tucker Carlson interview with Sergey Lavrov, several core themes emerge. It is extraordinary that Tucker Carlson, having interviewed Putin or Putin's doppelganger, he now goes on to minor characters um, in the gang, and it provides insight into Russia's foreign policy positioning, its narrative on the Ukraine conflict and the broader global tensions with the West. And Lavrov's rhetoric, which is brilliant, of course, combines strategic messaging with historic grievances, emphasizing Russia's view of itself as both a victim of Western expansionism and a champion of a multipolar world order. It is extraordinary that Russia worries about the West's expansion when it is Russia that has expanded into another country. Tucker Carlson, with his platform and style, facilitated the amplification of these views, offering a sympathetic and uninterrupted stage for Lavrov's assertions. The last time I did a cartoon of Tucker Carlson, when Putin did his thing, I imagined Tucker Carlson as a sort of ventriloquist puppet, and I think much the same thing is true now. Tucker Carlson, who's quite a tall man, is really the puppet for this state, and it is extraordinary. He sits and smiles and laps it up as if somebody's got their hand up his backside and is controlling what he says and getting on with the message they want to give. Lavrov consistently portrays the Ukraine conflict as a defensive measure rather than aggression. He argues that NATO's eastward expansion and the failure to honour the Minsk agreements left Russia no choice but to act. He dismisses the legitimacy of the Ukraine government's post-2014 elections, referring to them as US-backed coups, and he frames the special military operation as necessary to protect Russian speakers in Ukraine, whose rights, he claims, have been systematically eroded. He might just as well have been talking as Hitler before the invasion of Czechoslovakia. And he emphasizes the hybrid war. This hybrid war characterization, blaming the US and NATO for escalating the conflict by supplying Ukraine with long-range weapons like ATACMS. He links these developments to the broader Western strategy of strategic dominance and describes Russia's testing of the Oreshnik hypersonic missile system as a signal of its willingness to defend its legitimate interests at all costs, including through nuclear deterrence. Lavrov's focus on the Minsk agreements underscores Russia's narrative of Western betrayal. He insists that Russia sought to resolve the Donbass issue through diplomacy, citing Ukraine's alleged sabotage of the agreements. And this stands in contrast to the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, which guaranteed Ukraine's territorial integrity in exchange for its relinquishment of nuclear weapons, a commitment that Lavrov avoids discussing, and Tucker Carlson doesn't even challenge, as it directly counters Russia's justification for its actions in Crimea and in eastern Ukraine. And nor, when he talks about diplomacy, does he mention the surreptitious and invasive actions of the Wagner Brigade and other paramilitary troops sent into the Donbass in 2013 and 2014. Tucker Carlson, known for his contrarian and populist views, provides a unique platform for Lavrov. Unlike traditional Western interviews, which might challenge Russian narratives, Carlson offers a relatively open and non-confrontational format, and this allows Lavrov to expound on his points without interruption, enhancing their rhetorical impact. Carlson, I like Carlson's interview technique. It's something that I try and adopt myself. I don't think it's necessarily right to be constantly talking over the interviewer or constantly talking over the person being interviewed, or constantly nudging them and contradicting them. I think a little nudging and I think a little bit of enthusiastic interjection lets you know that you've not fallen asleep, but it's to aid the interview, the narrative of the interview, rather than to contradict the narrative of the interview, which I think is good. So from that point of view, I like what Tucker Carlson does. But there are ways of undermining the narrative and gently probing so that the alternative narratives are addressed. And he doesn't do that at all. He is a puppy or a puppet, squalidly perched on the hand of Lavrov or Putin or Putin's doppelganger or whoever he chooses to sit on. I hope these hands have been washed between events, and otherwise it gets very unsightly. Carlson's questions, often laden with skepticism towards US foreign policy, resonate with Lavrov's critique of American efforts and American plans, and create a shared space for anti-establishment discourse. Let's go through some of the things that Lavrov actually says. He says, it's obvious that Ukrainians would not be able to do what they're doing with long-range modern weapons without direct participation of American servicemen. Well, that's very interesting. So he's pushing forward the idea of this proxy war orchestrated by the US and saying it's obvious that Ukrainians wouldn't be able to defend themselves without help. So why don't they just lie down and die? That's his basic message there. As for the Oreshnik missile test, he says, the message we wanted to send by testing this hypersonic system is that we will be ready to use any means to defend our legitimate interests. Well, I think they made that very clear. They also chose a civilian site to bomb with the Oreshnik missile, and 2 people were badly injured, and a lot of civilian buildings were set on fire because this missile is not very targeted. But we wanted to send a message. Well, so did Hitler. In Hitler's case, it was called the Blitz. In negotiations with NATO, we're ready for negotiations, he says, on the basis of principles agreed in Istanbul, but now realities on the ground, including the annexation of new regions in Russia, must be considered. Well, I agree with that, but I don't think we would share the same interpretation of what those realities imply. And equally, the principles agreed in Istanbul were principles, again, rather like the Minsk agreements, principles with a loaded gun at the head of Ukraine. That's not a negotiation. That's an intimidation. That's not called negotiation. It's called intimidation. And as for the nuclear conflict, to speak about limited exchange of nuclear strikes is an invitation to disaster, which we don't want to have. Great. That's something that Lavrov has said, which is something that I think the world can work with. And Lavrov knows it, by the way. His statements reflect a hardened stance, certainly, highlighting Russia's intention to define the terms of any future settlement. The focus on realities on the ground indicates Russia's insistence on maintaining territorial gains, while his emphasis on NATO underscores Moscow's non-negotiable demand for Ukraine's neutrality. By invoking the Oreshnik test, Lavrov aims to reinforce Russia's readiness to escalate if provoked further, using nuclear deterrence as a central pillar. Carlson's platform, meanwhile, provides the Kremlin with access to a Western audience that may be sceptical of their own governments. By positioning himself as an alternative voice, Carlson inadvertently aids Russia in disseminating its narratives, especially among disenchanted conservatives in the US, who have got this idea themselves that the US is paying too much money to Ukraine. But we pay for freedom. And if Russia is coming for Ukraine today, they will come for Poland, for the Baltic states tomorrow. The freedom of one country depends on the freedom of another. The interview represents a convergence of Russian strategic messaging and Carlson's critique of US foreign policy. Lavrov capitalized on the opportunity to articulate Russia's grievances and justifications, presenting them as a reasonable and rooted response in international law. While Carlson's approach amplifies dissenting voices in the West, it also raises questions about the ethical implications of offering such a platform without rigorous interrogation of contentious claims. And by the way, I'm making this video in response to a comment by Custos Secretus 5737, who says, for the other side of the story, I was talking about the Budapest Memorandum and why its vagueness is a hindrance to progress. For the other side of the story, Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov's interview to Tucker Carlson in Moscow, December the 6th, 2024. Well, I've given you my response to that, And Tucker Carlson, as ever, is interesting, and Lavrov, as ever, is erudite and extremely well prepared. But, after so many years as the foreign minister, he should be. He is probably one of the most... I think he is the longest serving foreign minister in the world, and he is a seasoned and efficient diplomat. And, I always think of that moment when Liz Truss tried to outstare him, tried to play chicken with Lavrov. What a stupid person. What a stupid person. And she wasn't properly prepared and tried to maintain that Rostov-on-Don was in Ukraine rather than in Russia. She hadn't done her homework, which is a problem that besets so many people at the top of the Conservative Party and is probably responsible for so many of the failures in the last 8 years. But I hope I've given you a taste of what Lavrov was saying to Tucker Carlson, and I've given you a taste of Tucker Carlson. As I say, wash your hands before use.